My name is Matthew Todd, and welcome to Inside the Scale Up. This is the podcast for founders and executives in tech looking to make an impact and learn from their peers within the tech business. We lift the lid on tech businesses, interviewing leaders and following their journey from startup to scale up and beyond, covering everything from developing product market fit, funding and fundraising models to value proposition structure and growth marketing. We learn from their journey so that you can understand how they really work, the failures, the successes, the lessons along the way, so that you can take their learnings and apply them within your own startup or scale up and join the ever-growing list of high-growth UK SaaS businesses. Hey, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm here today, really pleased to be joined by Dan Pidcock, founder of Gleanly. As always, as you should know by now, if you've heard the past episodes, I like guests to introduce themselves, their business, and give us their elevator pitch before we kind of dive in and find out a little bit more about how you got to where you are now. So, yeah, good morning, Dan. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
No worries. So, over to you. Tell our listeners about you and your business.
So my name is Dan Pidcock. I'm a UX researcher and designer, and I have a product called Gleanly. Gleanly is a knowledge repository, so that especially aimed at large organizations, because they have the most difficult problem to solve with keeping hold of all the knowledge. So it was originally designed as a UX tool to be a place to store all of the learnings from UX research. But actually one thing we've learned through building it is knowledge affects every part of a business. So the most common thing that we're solving for the people that use it is kind of spreading knowledge throughout an organization, finding all of those different teams that have learned things that can help other people. So it increases the retention of knowledge, and it means we don't forget it all. Especially larger companies tend to have very short memories. But actually the biggest benefit is the innovation and collaboration that comes out of such a thing.
Cool, fantastic. That sounds interesting. And yeah, we'll dig into what that looks like in a little bit more detail. So yeah, you mentioned your background is working in UX. So what was it that led you to kind of try and create Gleanly in the first place?
Well, I was actually working for Just Eat, the world's biggest food takeaway organization. And I actually ended up becoming the head of accessibility for the company, kind of accidentally, actually. The problem we had is we had a small team of mostly people who had other jobs and other roles within the company as well, working on the project. And we were getting knowledge and research data from the whole company. So we had over 140 people just with research in their names, other people like business analysts and project managers, all sorts that had knowledge and evidence that would help us with accessibility. And it was just impossible to handle, right? It was like a tidal wave of information. And we already had a problem at the company that everything was done with reports, and those reports would be written and then put into Google Drive. We used to call it Google Grave because it's where research went to die. And we knew this was a problem anyway, but when it came to the accessibility team, it suddenly it meant that we were unable to really handle and perform as we would like to. So I started looking into what products, what processes existed already, and there wasn't really anything. All the products out there had really been designed by startups for startups. So it's people working on a small project with very tight scope. And I mean, context is the word I use 1,000 times a day, but you'd have the context of this particular app that does a particular thing. In a company like Just Eat, where they have hundreds of brands around the world and they have hundreds of aspects to that brand, you've got the customer facing things, you've got restaurant, internal, even like they had their own custom tools for marketing and AdWords and things like that. So it's insanely complex. So having a system that allowed us all to contribute and collaborate, but also have the context of so many different cultures and products and brands and such like was impossible. So I set about developing a process, and I should say it wasn't me that solely that invented this. It was very much a product of hundreds of people, but particularly some of my teammates. I always shout out David Yates, who was a real key person who kind of I suppose he put me onto the solution that became Atomic UX Research. So he was drawing on a board like how you could different knowledge could connect to other different knowledge, and how we could break things down. And it reminded me of the design process, which is atomic design, where you break down a UI design into its constituent parts. So every web page is made out of molecules and organisms, and each organism has atoms. And I thought, well, actually, we could probably do the same with knowledge. And when we tried to break down a piece of knowledge, we found it had 4 distinct conduit parts: where we learnt it, which is what we call the experiment; what we learnt, the kind of factual information that we learnt, which we call the fact; what that actually means, how that's relevant to us, which is the insight, and then what we're going to do about it. So what we call the recommendation. At the time, we called it conclusion. That sounds very simple, and it is very simple, but it's actually incredibly powerful. And by having been able to use each of those elements as nodes of information, it means we could kind of network all the knowledge. Matt knows this, I know this, we bring that together, and it tells us something interesting, and that leads us into a different direction. From going in that direction, we learn more things, we can connect things up, and maybe what we thought we knew earlier on, we find isn't true or is less relevant for a different part, but maybe we'll find other aspects that take us, just kind of grow that information. So we're able to create these kind of self-managed nodes, which meant that a massive company like Just Eat, with thousands and thousands of people creating knowledge, could all input and take out. And also, I suppose the thing that really kind of was the reason for its success is that it also was just a better way of understanding the research you were doing. And fundamentally, when there was lots of people who actually don't use the atomic process as a repository system, as a way to scale up a knowledge repository, but actually just use it as a way to synthesize what they're learning. And it's actually really powerful just in that respect, which is completely accidental. It's just pure chance. It also helped that there was a famous guy called Thomas Sharon, who at the time was head of UX for WeWork. I think he's Goldman Sachs now. So he was working on a very similar problem, which he also called Atomic UX Research. So we got in touch and had a chat, and actually what he was doing was almost kind of a part of what we were doing. So we kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, aligned our processes together.
I see.
And because he is so well known and so well respected, an amazing guy, that meant a lot of people took it seriously, and very quickly it went around the world. And I think for the most part, I would say now almost all UX people would have at least heard of it if they haven't tried it or using it. Or would have a good idea about what it is. So it's been quite amazing for me to see that. See this thing that I've been a part of. I remember the first time I spoke at a big conference in Brighton, and people came up. One group came up to me, and they had flown in from India, and they were using it in an agency in India. And I was, wow, this is crazy, and people around the globe using it. And part of I actually left Just Eat to kind of pursue this this concept, and went to work with a few other organisations to see how we could use this process within the organisation. But it's very clear that we needed a specific tool built around this process, and that's where Gleanly came about. So the past 3 years or so, we've been building this custom software to be this kind of scalable repository system. It's being used by some really big brands. It's still very much a startup. We've very much kind of we've got a very mature product now, but we're just getting to that point. We've got to that point now where we're looking to scale the product up. But we've got some really impressive customers. We're coming for the first customers are coming up for their 3-year renewal. I've just spoken to the first few customers that are due to renew for their 3rd year, and all 3 of those are giving a thumbs up, saying they're going to be doing it. So, yeah, it's reassuring that after 3 years, they still love it.
That's great news.
It's still valuable to them.
Yeah. And just for people listening, are there any kind of companies that our audience might know that you've got as customers?
Is it mostly a UK demographic?
Mostly, yeah.
So UK brands, probably one of the biggest is Adobe, the software giant. I think most people around the world would have heard of that. Admiral Group, particularly Confused.com. We've got Slimming World. There's quite a few. Most of the customers, so very few of our customers are UK based. There's a good spread around the world. We've got for some reason, particularly popular in France, which I love because it's an excuse to go out to Paris every now and again. So I'm very happy about that. So a lot of especially larger brands, so one of our biggest customers is a company called Heidelberg Cement. And I have to be honest, when, I had a meeting set up with them, I was like, okay, it's Mr. Heidelberg down the road cement company. I didn't realize it's one of the biggest companies in the world. Right? I'd never heard of them. And it's always interesting to me. One of the things that's really kind of been interesting through this is seeing how UX and research and knowledge management is approached in all of these big companies that maybe you almost don't think of, and there's so many different things happening all around the world that you always hear the big brands, Tesla and Google and all of those kind of tech brands, and you don't realize that just the company that provides the concrete that builds everything. They have an incredibly intensely complicated tech infrastructure. Of course they do. It makes perfect sense, but we just don't think about it. And in many ways, they're so much bigger and more interesting than the Ubers of these world.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. There's a lot of big businesses that you might not necessarily hear of in the media, but are actually underpinning, so many other businesses and are massive in their own right.
Absolutely. It's one thing I've always thought with companies I've worked with as a kind of UX consultant, or when I work directly with customers, quite rarely is it the really sexy brands that have the really sexy projects. Because normally they've kind of solved things already, and it's when you go to those boring sounding brands or the companies that are doing something either quite niche or maybe a bit dry, and you think, well, this isn't going to be much fun. And then they show you the problem and you go, oh my Lord, we can do something here. There's something really exciting to achieve, and you come away with a real sense of achievement, I think, with those. Yeah,
absolutely. And when it comes to, working with companies of that size and scale, obviously you said earlier on that the product is really, and the process is really designed for companies that operate at that scale. Are there any kind of challenges you faced kind of going directly into enterprise companies rather than, starting with the smaller businesses?
It's a different problem, I think. The reason we were focused on enterprise is obviously I was trying to solve this within a blue chip enterprise, FTSE 100 tech company. There was nothing serving those companies. And so that's where there was definitely a massive gap in the market. And that's where the biggest challenge was. And it's the reason it wasn't being served. So that's where the biggest opportunity was. And I very much believe in designing for extremes. So those extremes could be that the company's really big, but it could also be that the company's really small. Maybe the extreme is that they just haven't got anyone dedicated to research, for instance. But in this case, it's that they've got some of the companies I work with, they have whole dedicated insight management teams. They've got teams of people just there, not to do research, not to provide research, but to manage the research that people are doing. And so it's an incredibly expensive and difficult problem for them to solve. And every time they forget something, have to relearn it, or they forget something and end up building something that that they should have known wouldn't work. It's costly and expensive and frustrating as well. One of the biggest frustrations when I was at Just Eat was that we would relearn the same things again and again, and people would make mistakes because they didn't know this research had already been done.
Yeah.
And you would do this research knowing that it was really useful and really valuable, and probably no one would ever see it again. So that's obviously something that's changed for them now, of course. But they weren't unusual, and it was really interesting. The first company I spoke to after Just Eat was Monzo and Mood.com. So I think it was actually Monzo I spoke to because I really respected their UX team. And they said, yeah, we've got this problem, or you need to speak to Moo.com. The head of UX over there was complaining about this very issue the other day. So I spoke to them. They went, you need to speak to so-and-so. And it was this kind of network effect. Every time I spoke to somebody about this problem, they went, yeah, this is a real big problem. And them, you need to speak to them next. And so we've done no marketing whatsoever. All of our growth has purely been organic because either people have heard of us, they've seen me speak, or they've read my articles, but mostly it's because someone said, yeah, we had that problem, we started using Gleanly, or they've left a company and gone somewhere else and went, we use so-and-so, at this last company we use Gleanly. And that's where all our growth is coming from at the moment. That needs to change, of course, but as a small startup, it's been really beneficial to us because we've really focused on a real problem, a problem that a lot of companies are actually facing. In the early days, especially, we actually had to turn people down. We could only we started with alpha customers, we called them. So these are real customers paying an amount of money. It was a fairly small amount of money, but basically we wanted them to commit to say, we're solving this problem. You're committed to kind of really their investment was sharing their knowledge with us and giving them quite intimate access to their company, which, especially for these quite big organizations, I mentioned the name Adobe, you can imagine they've got a lot of very confidential and very business critical, very valuable information going on. And they gave us really intimate access to that, which is a big, brave move for them. And also investing, when you invest into, as a company, you take on a repository, you are investing in that. It's a lot of time and effort and man hours have been put in to building this knowledge repository. And hopefully the tool makes it easy as possible, but you're still kind of investing into that landscape, into that product. So they had to take a big gamble on us because we had a very, very basic prototype. Our first prototype that people were paying to use didn't have search. For a repository, it's like, fundamental. And we said, look, you can put the information in. That's good enough for now. We'll learn how to build search through you. And so we started, at first we wanted to only have 5 customers. In the first 6 months, we had 10. And we said, right, we have to stop there. Because we just, it's going to take us too much time to manage that many customers. Because it's very, as I say, very intimate, very regular connections. So we had to be tough on ourselves to say, no, Mr. Company, that is really impressive and we'd love to have you on our roster. We just haven't got the time to deal with you right now, and we won't be able to get the most out of that relationship. We'll call you back in 6 months' time, and hopefully you'll still want us, and hopefully you'll still have that budget available and haven't invested somewhere else.
And you weren't scared of losing them as a customer?
I was scared of them, absolutely, yeah. And of course, some of those people, we actually had a list of about 2,000 names of people that hadn't said they want to use our product, but were interested, if that makes sense. So they were signing up for the beta. And the longer we sat on that, the older that list came, and people were leaving companies, and some of those emails wouldn't exist anymore. And it was very stressful. But we definitely didn't want to go too early and end up people walking away going, we tried that Gleanly thing, it was crap. It was just no use to us. It was useless. And so we did do the whole MVP thing. We released it at the minimum viable product, but we had to wait till it was viable. And that was tough. That was really tough.
I think that's interesting because I see a lot of people misunderstand what an MVP is, and I think it's become so abused that MVP is almost itself not viable as a concept in the way that many people implement it, and they think it's the smallest thing they can ship to someone versus the smallest thing that actually adds real, genuine value goes, some way, some decent way to solving that problem for them.
You're absolutely right. I mean, if you consider really our first MVP was a whiteboard and sticky notes. That's how we were testing the process. That's how we were discovering if this worked. And then our next MVP was Airtable. We were using Airtable for a long time as, off the shelf product to be able to build a repository using this process and seeing how it scaled and how it worked. And it just, there was limits. I won't go into them, but there was limits to what that could actually achieve. And it was very clear we needed to build something custom, but we weren't setting out to build a custom product. We're setting out to solve this problem. So then the first customers I worked with outside of Just Eat, they were paying me to help them with knowledge management and to scale repository and such like. But we didn't have a product at that stage. So I suppose in that regard, we were selling our product before we even had a product. And then once we had one that was good enough to start customers actually using and putting information in, that was the minimum thing. But they were coming on with the expectation this isn't a finished product. This is a product they're going to help us build. But, so in that regard, we were kind of releasing far too early, but in a managed way. In a way that was right. And there's so much more I would like to do. I've got some really grand plans for the product, and it fundamentally works. It's a fully fledged repository. It does everything repository needs to do. But it's the frustration now is I've got all of these great ideas that I really want to implement, but we need to go through the process. It needs to be proven. It needs to be valuable. We're completely guided by our customers. So, we work with really talented UX and product people. And so all companies should be listening to their customers beyond anything else, but us particularly, because our customers are people who know product better than me, probably. So we're constantly we're completely guided by them almost. We have a rough timeline and a rough kind of roadmap, kind of like a framework for where we want to be development wise, and then each quarter we work on a different theme. And the customers tell us what they want us to do, what would be the most valuable problems for us to solve for them. Yeah. So sometimes we overrule, absolutely, but that's based on evidence.
Yeah, so very, very customer driven.
Yeah. For example, we've got an evidence score. And I was really excited about this evidence score to start off with. I still am. It's a great thing. But we had plans, and we actually released a version where rather than being a very simple score, it was very clever. It kind of took into account all the different types of evidence, where the evidence had come from, the age of the evidence, things like that, to give a really precise scoring to how much evidence you had to something. And what we found is that was actually a negative. Customers were over focusing on that, and they were taking far too long. It was becoming a stranglehold. They were so hyper focused on trying to get that score absolutely perfect. And worse, they were making decisions on that score. And that score should help people if they're moving very quickly, but it should never be making decisions. It doesn't know what the truth is. Do you know what I mean? It's evidence score, not a truth score, not a how important score. And so we actually had to take the difficult decision to chuck away a load of that work and say, no, we're just going back to a basic score. Now, of course, new customers come in and go, oh, I wish you could do this. I wish you could do that. Can we do this? And I'm like, yeah, we can do that. We did it. You don't want it, I promise you. So we kind of now know more than them in that regard. We've tried it. It doesn't work. It has a negative effect. But every customer pretty much asks for it.
That's interesting. I think it's really good and shows that you genuinely are connected to the problem, that you're willing to pull something from the product if you think it is steering people in the wrong direction. I think not enough people do that.
And that can be, I mean, I suppose in a way you could argue that we should have validated before we built that it wouldn't work or it'd have that negative effect. But sometimes there's some things you can't learn till you release. So it meant that we ended up spending time building something we had to chuck it in the bin, which is never a good thing. But it was important for us to do that and to be honest about ourselves.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And do you find with your customer base being obviously deeply in product and UX, does that create any kind of challenges? Does it kind of raise the bar that you then have to meet for your own UX as well? Does that, make things a little bit more challenging?
Absolutely. There's it's two sides to it. On one side, most of our customers are product designers and product researchers, project managers, and they mostly work in digital products. We've got plenty of customers that are in the service or physical product industry as well.
Yeah.
But there's still parallels with those. So the good side is, for the most part, they understand. They're also running teams and have so many hours in the day and such like. I suppose on the other side, they're mostly very big companies, and we have lots of small startups and even individual researchers as well, but it tends to be the larger companies we work closest with, because it's them we're focused on. So the feedback I get is mostly from larger customers, and of course they're used to having big budgets and big teams and fairly quick turnarounds. Whereas I would say we're very fast for such a small team, but we are a very, very small team. We can only work on one thing at a time, two things at most, back end and front end. That can be particularly frustrating, because obviously I get detailed and a great deal of feedback. We've got a Slack community. I had a week off last week, first week off for a long time, and I came back and the feature and bugs channels were almost full of suggestions. And I mean, the bugs ones, the team are on top of, but the feature suggestions, they're going in our backlog and we have to prioritize them. And the good news is the customers will help us, and they'll be honest with us about, really, do they want this, or do they need this? Is this a blocker, or is this something that would just be really nice? There's pros and cons, and they really understand the process is the biggest pro. Yeah,
no, this is good that you're not having to educate them on that, and that they do have that level of understanding as well.
And they know when we promise something, it won't be tomorrow,
Yeah. No,
for the most
not
part,
too unrealistic.
Exactly, yeah. And for the most part, we tend to be very good at estimating our time. We've only had one project since we've been working with paying customers where we've gone over our budgeted time, but we actually said at the beginning, we don't know how long it's going to take. We're going to we think it's going to take 2 months. It ended up taking more than double that. And actually our investors, I went to at one stage and said, we're actually running over time on this. And they went, Dan, don't worry. We've never known a tech company investment actually deliver on time and deliver what they've said they're going to do. So I think in that regard, we've been with customers, we've been communicating with them what to expect and when to expect it, and managing their expectations. So I think that's really helpful as well. If we were promising everything within a week and then we took months to deliver it, perhaps they'd be more frustrated.
Yeah, you've got to be open and honest with them, and then you get that back as well from them, don't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned in investment there, how has the business been, funded and built? I know when we talked before as well, you kind of mentioned the importance of creating something that is sustainable and genuinely has value. I'd be interested in hearing a little bit about, more about that.
Yeah, so I started Gleanly with a colleague and friend of mine that I was working with, and so the first version of Gleanly, the basic thing that we took to customers and to investors, was built in our own time, weekends and evenings. Both of us having a young family as well, so that was a lot of fun. So we had a basic product. We had some customers lined up that were willing to pay for it, and that enabled us to get the first round of pre-seed investment. We got our pre-seed investment unusually from a VC company. So normally at that stage it'd be angels or individuals. And it's been actually a really positive experience. It's the first time I've taken investment myself. I've worked for startups before and been in companies that have raised investment and had to manage investors and such like, but I've never been directly in front of them necessarily. So that was very much a learning experience. The thing we really struggled with now is we're a B2B company, and building a product that most investors probably don't really understand. They may probably understand that they're is a need for knowledge and a knowledge retention and sharing that knowledge. But for most investors, if they have worked in tech, they haven't worked in tech for a long time. And they probably even then were working in a different part of it, maybe not quite actually within a tech team. So, they're used to receiving reports and they probably don't see anything wrong with that. So it's investors invest in what they understand and what they know, rightly so.
Yep.
And we kind of aren't aiming at the kind of people that are or would be investors. So that's been a really real struggle, not just to explain what it is, but the scale of the opportunity and how many companies can use this. And I get asked all the time, well, how many companies have UX teams? Well, first of all, it's not just for UX people, but all big companies, basically.
Yes.
All companies have UX. And it's been really interesting through COVID. I'm going slightly off subject here, please excuse me. But it's been really interesting during COVID, speaking to UX teams around different companies and in lots of different industries. So we'll have a company like SlemmyWorld come to us and say, every time Boris Johnson goes on the TV, our sign-ups rocket. It doesn't matter what he's talking about, whether he's talking about obesity or not. It must be just something about Boris Johnson. I don't know. But every time anyone mentions anything to do with COVID on TV, people sign up to SlemmyWorld. And so we're finding it hard to manage all of these new subscribers and dealing with this opportunity. And the company's turning to the UX team to help manage that. And then you speak to another company, I won't mention any names, but it'd be obvious it would affect almost all airlines. We've got a couple of airlines on our books. And they would say, yeah, Dan, it's really difficult right now. We've lost 90% of our revenue. This is obviously before the restrictions are lifted. And the company, we're losing hundreds, if not thousands of our colleagues, and they're turning to the UX team to solve that problem. And it seems like whatever happens within a company, whether it's good or bad, the UX will deal with it. And which is great news, I suppose, for me and my industry and my product. But it is interesting that companies seem to have now not just realized that UX exists, but now see it as kind of the magic sticking plaster for whatever needs to be done.
I see. Much like agile ways of working, UX is almost the next thing.
Yeah, it was design thinking or those kind of things. It's now we'll get some UX people on it. That's how we'll deal with it. They're problem solvers, I suppose. So, I mean, it makes sense, and it's certainly a positive thing, especially for my company, but I think the industry as a whole. UX people are starting to be recognised as being able to solve problems, which is great. Whether they've been slightly over, the expectations are slightly too high, perhaps. I don't know. We'll see. But so the question I get from investors is, how big is the problem? How big is the market? And it's hard to quantify how big it is, because even I'm surprised. And as I say, I meet all these companies that I didn't even know existed, and they have these massive scale UX and insights team. So the problem for us now, so when we actually, let me go back. So when we raised the first seed investment, that was very exciting, but it came, I talked about COVID, and that came at a time when COVID in the UK was at its peak. It was where the stock market, if you remember when the stock market absolutely crashed to the floor, I was sitting behind a computer, trying desperately to get this, talk to that lawyer and that solicitor, the investors over here, and trying to get everything signed. Our solicitors were being particularly difficult and picking up on every tiny little thing, to everyone's frustration. And our investors were like, guys, we need to get this sorted, because our investors are questioning, what is money worth even anymore? Do we still have a stock market? It was that kind of, the world is imploding. So if you want this money, we need to get this done. Sadly, at the same time, my wife's mum was dying, and my wife was full-time caring for her at home at her mum's house while she had her last few weeks. And we had a young daughter, only a couple of months old. So it did feel like it was definitely the most stressful time in my life. And I think only part of that was to do with raising investment. Since then, our investors have been great. They've been lovely people to work with. They haven't tried to get away with the business. Their advice have been invaluable. And, I don't consider myself really a business person or a product person. And we'd be really lucky that one of our individual investors we've got is actually ex-CFO of IKEA. So I've been able to kind of bend his ear for financial advice and that kind of strategical advice, which has been great. So our investment experience has been really positive. The struggle we're having now, we're now at a point where we want to raise kind of what you'd call seed funding, so we can kind of scale massively. We're growing organically, but what we need to do is kind of really hypercharge that. So the problem we have now is, one, explaining to investors who we are and what we do and what the scale of the business is. The other thing is, because we're not trying to raise millions, we're not trying to raise a pre-seed round, we're kind of in a bit of a no man's land. So that's been really frustrating as well. And I've had a lot of pitch calls with companies where I've told them how much we're trying to raise, and at the end, like, so our minimum check size is X. I'm like, well, that's like 4 times what we're trying to raise at the moment. And we've wasted each other's time, and it's frustrating because I've said at the beginning, this is what we're trying to raise, this is what we're trying to do, and those calls, they take a lot out of you. I imagine there's a few people,
it's a lot of work involved.
Have you done that kind of thing, Matt?
Yes, been involved in a lot of the prep for that, as well as some of those calls, and it's a lot of effort on both parts. So it's the trouble when investors have researchers and they've got quotas to meet for number of meetings booked, and the rest of it. Sometimes you mentioned that evidence metric. Sometimes I think they're also incentivized for the wrong metrics, so therefore you do end up in a situation where actually it probably isn't going to be a good fit.
Yeah, one of the most common questions I get asked is, kind of what's your sign-up rates, what's your profit, all this kind of thing. And so, we're making money, basically. We're technically profitable right now, only just, and it changes on a monthly basis, if I'm being honest. But that's grown all organically. We make more money than Uber. It's the truth of it. We make more money than Deliveroo, a lot more money, because we're not in any debt. We're making money, and that's not what they want to hear. They want to hear they want BS, basically, and that's the thing that's really frustrating. I'm a UX person, and I'm very data driven. As a person, I'd like to think I'm very honest, but I find it hard to self-aggrandize and kind of blow smoke, and that's not a good thing for raising money. And actually, I've had investors and advice from people in that industry saying, you need to just basically add a 0 to that figure, we'll make up some kind of sum to and it's like, well, no, I'm not doing that. If I don't have the evidence to say this is what we're going to do, I'm not going to say we're going to do it. And the figures we've got are good enough on their own. You need to say you're going to, basically, I was going to use a phrase that my dad would use, and I don't know, might have to beep this, but do wonders and shit thunders. And and that's fine. I believe in our company. I know that we can do wonderful things, but there's a reason why, I can't remember his name, but the chap at WeWork managed to raise all of these billions of pounds on a company that actually just didn't work fundamentally, and it's because he was good at BSing. And there
are a lot of examples of that.
Yeah, exactly. There's a few people I can think of in the public eye who are seen as these wonderful business people and actually are just BSers. There's the recent the lady Theranos. She's actually been put in prison now for fraud, and it seems that the difference between what she was doing that's considered illegal and she's now locked up for, and what a lot of very successful tech founders are doing, I can't really necessarily see the difference there. And it's not how I want to operate. I don't want to be a business that doesn't make money. I don't want to be a business that doesn't provide value and actually do something. I don't want anyone to put their hard-earned money into our company and me not be truthful about that situation. And that's probably going to be what I'm doing, to be honest.
No, I think it's a good way to run a business and grow a business. And I think not every investor, but there are a significant number of investors, especially a very US-centric model. And what we're trying to bring with this podcast is, more diverse opinions and perspectives on that. But there's a lot of things that are kind of growth at any cost. And then we will choose when we turn that profit lever or sell it to someone with the intention that they will then pay an awful lot of money for it and assume that they can then flip that switch to make it massively profitable whenever they choose. And I don't think that is a sustainable way. I think there are a lot of casualties with that
or
approach.
Even true. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a good example is, I talked about Just Eat earlier. So that's an industry I know fairly well. And I remember I was working at Just Eat when their shares were downgraded by the Bank of England because the guy at the Bank of England was looking out his window and he was seeing Deliveroo bikes going left, right, but he wasn't seeing Just Eat bikes going left, right. And what he didn't realize is, well, Just Eat doesn't have bikes, or didn't at that stage. And if you see any, they're actually being bought and paid for by the restaurant with a hefty discount for having the logo on the side. And, their model of actually doing the logistics, which is the difficult and expensive bit, actually isn't all that sustainable, isn't all that growth orientated. Just Eat was very clever in that when they started, they didn't focus on London. They were started in Norway, if I'm not mistaken, and David Buttress, who was their CEO for a long time and oversaw their massive growth, brought them to the UK. But he focused on the smaller cities and the smaller towns big enough to sustain a company like Just Eat and have plenty of restaurants and plenty of people wanting food, but didn't have the competitive nature of London, etc., which I think is really clever. And I know that their method of choosing whether to go into a country, or leaving a country was, can we be the biggest? And their biggest metric, their business metric for the biggest is number one, at least 4 times bigger than number 2, because they had learned that's the only way they could turn a profit. It seems insane. All they're doing is saying, this guy over here wants a pizza and taking 20% for the privilege. But they had worked out that they could only turn a profit if they're number 1 and at least 4 times bigger than number 2. And if they're not 4 times bigger than number 2, they'll either buy number 2 or leave that market.
Yeah.
And that is why that they grew to the extent they did. They're struggling a bit more now, I think. But and then Deliveroo obviously has been doing very well, but they're not making any money, quite the opposite. And when COVID hits, probably a lot of people know this already, but it really caused them a lot of problems, because every time they sold a meal, it would cost them money. And suddenly with COVID, they were selling a lot more meals than they were expecting to. So they were losing a lot more money than they were expecting to. That isn't a business. That's a charity, surely. No, I'm discounting. I'm paying my money for you to eat. That isn't a business. And obviously, there's people a lot smarter than me that would say, well, okay, well, the thing is then we get market share, et cetera, et cetera. But if your business can be scuppered by people using it, that doesn't make sense to me. It just doesn't. And I think that's probably a naivety. It's probably a naivety. But yeah, we don't have a freemium version of our product. Maybe we should do. We have a free trial of our product. We charge per user, which I'm not happy with. One of the struggles we have is when we were in alpha mode, the companies paid a small fee to have access to it, and then they just had open access. And it meant that everybody in the organization could have access to the repository and could contribute and collaborate. Every other product on the market has a per seat pricing. So you have researchers that pay and non-researchers that don't. Now, this is a problem for us, because I know that companies are more successful if everybody in the organization can be involved with that. I fundamentally, personally, just don't like this kind of gatekeeping of, I'm a researcher, I can create knowledge, you're not. Your knowledge isn't valuable enough to record. That just doesn't make sense to me. And quite often the people with the most valuable knowledge, especially developers, for instance, in a tech company, very rarely they're included in the conversation around knowledge management. And I suppose they have their own things like GitHub and such like, but and Jira and tools like that. But it's slightly different kind of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So so we had to make a decision. How can we do this? Do we just have a set fee? And how do we create that set fee that it's not only fair for all different size companies? Because obviously, if we say we charge 10 grand, okay, that's going to be great value for a big company like Adobe. It's going to be really crappy for that individual who's working on a small project. And if we say, okay, well, we'll limit it in some way, then the big companies are going to say, well, we'll buy the cheapest one because we only have 3 researchers, so we need 3 licenses, and they're missing all of those 50 people that would have had the value. So we're not solving anything there. So that's been a real struggle. I haven't solved that yet. If anyone listening has got any ideas, please get in touch. So,
but have you ever thought about? Not to kind of jump in and turn it into a consultation, but have you looked at other metrics that do align incentives, like the amount of information stored versus the number of people contributing to that? Have you kind of explored those kind of areas?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we've tested those, but we've definitely thought about things like that. And I suppose the problem is fundamentally when you charge for something, it's like a tax. You tax the things you don't want, right?
Yeah.
So we're taxing the amount of users. So it means that they're and the reason we decided just to stick with that at the moment is because it's the easiest for customers to understand. It's the easiest to be compared by. It's the easiest, and that isn't a good answer for a solution, but it's the truthful one.
It's a low kind of barrier, I suppose. If customers are used to those kind of pricing models, it's something they understand already, isn't it?
If we have a limit on the amount of knowledge stored, for instance, first of all, the amount of knowledge isn't a reflection of value, which has been really interesting. We have some customers that, let's say we have 2 customers the same size, and one is there's 50 people in there all the time, constantly doing something. Like whenever I look at their account, it's just firing away, doing all sorts. And there's another one that it just blips once or twice a week. There's something happening, or maybe once a month they're adding something to it. And when I speak to those customers, it actually, you don't know which one's getting the value. They might both be getting the value, they might neither. So the amount of use certainly isn't a reflection of value, which is interesting. But the danger is if we charge based on amount of knowledge, that say they start deleting when they start hitting a level.
I see. Yeah.
And that's the worst possible thing. We always already have to explain, no, you don't get rid of anything because someone will come along in the future and learn from that knowledge.
Yeah.
So, it's a difficult one. And obviously then also if we charge by amount of knowledge, it's hard to compare us, which could be good or bad, really, I suppose, depending how we play it. I suppose we're not at the scale that we need to worry too much about that at the moment. But it is something I would like to change and solve, and maybe just end up. I think once we have more data to the average amount different organizations spend, we could probably start looking at saying, right, we're just going to have a flat fee where you have unlimited use.
I see.
At this kind of scale, and then like a smaller one for individuals or something. We'll get that.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I guess coming from the product UX background that you have then as well. You said you're very much a product person. How have you found the challenges of selling?
I don't find selling difficult at all. I'm not a salesperson, but I am passionate about the product. I know the industry really well. I'm lucky that I'm working in an industry that is very receptive to new ideas, first of all.
Yeah.
And they appreciate honesty and forthrightness. So if I did go in, doing what investors expect to UX customers, and this does tend to be UX teams that bring us into an organization. So it tends to be researchers and UX designers and those kind of people within a team that I'm speaking to and making the decisions about whether to bring a product in. That's the other good thing as well. They tend to be decision makers. They tend to have a budget and allowed to just choose which tools they want to use. So that's quite great. Very rarely do we need to go up the chain.
That's good.
if I went in there and be like, yeah, this is the best thing on earth. It's awesome, guys. Come on, get involved. Yeah, you love it. You'll love it. They'll be like, all right, this person's an idiot. And I've had a few people say, oh yeah, your competitor X, Y, and Z. Oh, they're using salespeople, and they're like, oh my god, we can't bear it. And what they want is honesty. So I'll show them the product. I'll talk them through how it works. I'll show them where we're lacking and where we're strong, and I'll be really honest about, we know this isn't great and we're dealing with that. That'll be done in this time frame. We know this is a problem and we don't know how to deal with that. So if you have any ideas, and this is where we're really strong, and that works in this industry. It works really well.
Yeah, I think that's
so
really
I don't
good.
need to sell. I can just show the product and get excited about it in a real way, in an authentic way. And but mostly go in there looking to solve their problems. And the first questions I'm asking, as I think any salesperson would actually, is what do you need? What are you suffering with? And how can we solve it? But also being open to say, no, we can't solve that. And it has happened a few times where there's a particular need that a lot of customers have, and I have to say, we don't do that. I don't think we ever will, because it kind of falls out of scope for our product. And if you want that, either you need another tool to do that and our product, or just not our product at all.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I think it shows that problem, kind of centered approach. And you talk about they were salespeople, but I'd argue those are bad salespeople, because I think all good salespeople should be as passionate as you clearly are about solving the problem, because that brings the best quality customers on board.
I think it's difficult for anybody that isn't a UX person to sell a product like this, who doesn't know the industry very well, because I'm going to be honest with you. There's nothing complicated about UX. We make a big deal about it all. We've got all of these fancy names for things. There's a lot of gatekeeping in our industry. And there is a lot of nuance. But fundamentally, UX is easy to do, and there's a lot to learn to do it really well. But it is easy to do. It's not brain surgery by any stretch of the imagination. But when talking to mostly the people who are making these decisions about the product, they are very much that far end of really experienced researchers and UX designers, etc., or product people. And so they have very high expectations. They've got very clear, defined objectives and an idea of both the problems they've got and how they want to solve it, or what they expect from a product. And someone to come in without knowing that industry quite intently is going to really struggle to be able to talk to them on the same level. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. It's just different knowledge areas, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's like trying to sell a car to a car designer. It's a product. It's a product to people who design products, and or a car engineer perhaps. It's different to selling to the average person. So I think that's they've already got a problem there, and I can understand why they brought salespeople in, because there aren't enough UX people at the moment, and UX people tend not to be the kind of people who want or are particularly good at a sales job. They're not interested in that side of things. So you can't hire a load of UX people. They'd be too expensive, first of all, and they're just not interested in that. They want to be designing products. So what are you going to do? How are you going to scale a sales team? So it's something that we need to face as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Any kind of technical B2B product like this has, you need to, as you said, kind of have that real understanding and connection. But then once you do have that and you have that experience, you really will resonate with the people that you're trying to reach, because you deeply understand the problems that they're facing, and you're talking in their terms. So it's not like
fundamentally fundamentally the product just has to work. It has to work, has to provide value. Yeah. You have to be able to show the people who are buying it that it will do so. And if you can automate that, then hopefully you won't need salespeople. But you can't BS people in this industry. Absolutely not. And I suppose that's the reason that we've got a successful product and why I'm finding it hard to raise money.
Yeah, interesting that there's pros and cons to that, but I would argue that the quality of that approach and therefore the quality of that product can only be a good thing. Like as you said earlier about that kind of BS investment, you're kind of sidestepping that, which it might make it harder to raise investment, but I suppose when you do get that investment, you'll have the right investors on board that truly support that kind of mission and vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose what we really need is, they must exist like kind of UX investors. I wonder if that must be a thing. And I suppose there's another thing that is fundamentally opposed in investment and that world to how I see things, which is building a sustainable business that provides value and delivers a product. Because for the most part, investors don't want you to make money. They don't care about that. And as we said, they want growth at all costs. So the next investors come in and provide the value. So investors aren't investing in products or what the product provides. They don't care about the customers other than as a KPI. They don't care about value at all. What they care about is that it meets its next fundraising objectives.
Yeah, and I guess it's different time frames of thinking, isn't it? Are they in it for a shorter time frame than you are trying to optimize for? And that can create some challenges and almost like a false customer where you're no longer serving your real customers, but you're serving your investors instead. Yeah,
absolutely. That definitely can happen and does happen. And I think it's extremely common. We've been lucky so far that our natural growth and our kind of natural cadence has met the objectives of our investors. But I could see if that was misaligned, that would cause a lot of problems and cause company owners to be pushing for things like, we say, losing money on each sale, growing and bringing on maybe even lying to customers or overselling your products and under delivering just to build those KPIs at one end. Not worrying too much about the other end, because it means we're going to get the next investment. We're going to get that 10 grand investment. We're going to get that 10 million and then 60 million. And then, 150 million billion pound investment. Right now we're a massive company. Now we can focus on actually making some money, by which time something like COVID hits and it's too late.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's why I think you've got to find the right business model and the right investment model that goes along with that. But I think, as far as I'm concerned, I think, you're approaching it from a very genuine problem-oriented perspective that means you are going to get that brand loyalty. And you mentioned, customers renewing for year 3, etc. That's what happens if you do that right.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our thing now is making sure there's that pipeline is being filled from the other end. Well, actually, one of our growth things have been people in tech tend to move around quite a lot.
Yes,
and it sounds strange, but one of our, I wouldn't say it's our biggest, but one of our notable growth areas are people leaving one company, going to another and saying, oh yeah, we should use Gleanly. We use this over there. So maybe
absolutely. It's a valid growth strategy is to, be aware of people that have exposure moving.
I don't know whether you could call it a strategy, because it's definitely completely passive. Start encouraging people to leave their jobs.
but I think you can certainly reach out to them.
Absolutely. Well, and in fact, they, as I say, we don't. They tend to come to us, and it's quite gratifying having demo calls and sales meetings and seeing faces I recognise. And it means that it's working. It means that whatever happens, we're providing a valuable product. But I do recognise there's many products out there that were good and better than the competitors and didn't make it. So I'm not naive to know that that's the be all and end all. But I suppose as a product person, that's what I've been focused on, is building good product.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Building good products and helping others to do the same.
That dichotomy of product and business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a lot of people talking about things like product-led growth that really do, highlight the importance of, putting your product in front of your prospective customers and ensuring that they do see and recognize and get that value from it. Thankfully we are seeing kind of that kind of area and methodology, if you like, becoming more popular.
Do you think consumers are becoming more aware of quality?
Yeah, I think given the number of products they are exposed to, the number of platforms they are exposed to online, I think they have more, people have more options than they ever had before. Therefore, they have to make more decisions than they ever have done before. So I think the quality really does shine through. And I think truly resonating with your customers, being able to speak their language and truly understand their problems, I think is becoming ever more important. I think, the mistakes we see a lot of people making, and certainly from a marketing perspective, are trying to do B2B marketing a bit like it's an e-commerce brands a few years ago, where you could get away with more transactional kind of marketing techniques and tactics. But everyone's seen that, everyone's tired of that. No one needs another PDF that we all accept is just an expensive way for you to buy someone else's email address. Doesn't really add that much value, and people see through that now, and that what they really respect is a proper connection with the brand, the product, the problem that it's trying to solve. And I think authenticity, that then you're not just trying to pull a fast one and get them using something for the wrong reasons that doesn't solve their problems.
And I suppose it's with the breadth of the internet also becomes the other side, which is that you're much closer to that brand's customers as well. You can hear their actual real authentic experiences very easily. Yeah. So if a company isn't looking after those customers, aren't delivering on what they're promised, they're quickly going to get a reputation, right? Or you'd hope.
Yeah, especially in niche areas like this. I imagine if you were doing a really bad job of acquiring customers, and as you were saying earlier on, if you had accepted however many companies were on that wait list, at a time where they probably would have been disappointed, news will spread within that area of the industry.
Yeah, it's quite a tight industry in that regard, the UX industry, certainly. And that has its benefits, as the process is spread and the name of our company is spread. But yeah, absolutely. I suppose as people say, you're only as good as your last customer, and it'd be very easy to lose that trust.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that trust is key. I'm quite aware of time, and I don't want to keep you too long. But before we kind of wrap things up, is there anything else kind of for our audience that you would like to get across, or you think is valuable to them?
There's nothing I can think of. I know we had a list of things we were going to talk about.
Yeah, no, I think we've covered that really, really well, and I think people should take a lot away from this conversation about the importance of being true to solving that problem and not trying to rush things for vanity metrics, either fooling yourself or for the purposes of other parties. I think there's a lot to be said in what we've talked about for really understanding that problem and genuinely trying to solve it in the right way. So I hope people do pay attention to that. And as we've talked about, quality of not just product but entire experience, I hope people do take that on board and try and implement at least some of this approach.
I mean, that's obviously experience is the thing that my profession is completely focused on, and there's a reason why the biggest companies in the world are investing so heavily in that and are focused on that, and not just in the case of putting the sticking plaster on it, but also because the the experience is the thing, right?
Yes.
And I suppose that's one of the reasons why UX teams are being put into all sorts of different situations and up against all sorts of challenges that they might not have been in the past, is because, something as ill-defined as experience, or so wide as experience, can mean that it has a wide scope. But I do believe if a product can solve that, first of all, solve a problem, and solve it in a way that customers have a good experience, whether that is just being satisfied or to the point of singing the praises of the company. And we spoke briefly about designing for extremes. And I think that's one of the reasons I believe in that, is quite often people think about designing for the 80% and, solve, the 20% should be less of a focus, because then you've got 80% of the market, surely. But actually, when you design for that 20%, then you have 20% of the market that will never go anywhere else, that really love you. And probably what I tend to find is, if you design, when I say for the 20%, even for the 1%, the people at the far end of that spectrum that really are struggling, that's when you actually end up bringing along the rest of the 99%.
Yeah, absolutely. No, completely agree with that. And I think that's a really good place to leave it. If anyone is interested in what we're talking about, not just from the business building perspective, but also from the UX and research perspective, where's the best places for them to head to find out more about your approach, about your platform as well?
If you're interested in having a look at Gleanly, please go to Gleanly. It's GLEAN.ly. We've got a 30-day free trial, and it's not just for UX people. So anybody with any company that deals with knowledge will hopefully be interested in that. And I'd love any feedback, any thoughts you have on it. If you'd like to talk to me and get in contact, I'm on Twitter at Dan Piddy. That's PIDDY.
Cool, perfect. And I'll make sure we include those links for people in the description as well. But once again, thank you for taking the time to talk this morning. I think it has been a really, really interesting conversation from my perspective, but I think our audience will get a lot of value out of this as well. And I wish you all the best of luck in taking Gleanly forward the next steps of starting to scale that growth.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you so much for having me on here as well.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Inside the Scale Up. Remember, for the show notes and in-depth resources from today's guest, you can find these on the website insidethescaleup.com. You can also leave feedback on today's episode, as well as suggest guests and companies you'd like to hear from. Thank you for listening.